The flies found the dead before the Marines ever could. Corporal Henry Maddox watched them swarm above the limestone ridge, black clouds rising and falling with the Pacific wind, and he knew what waited in those caves. Okinawa had taught him that much in 82 days of killing. The battle that military planners called Operation Iceberg had become something else entirely, a grinding horror that consumed everything it touched. By June 1945, over 12,000 Americans had already died on this island. The Japanese losses numbered beyond counting. And somewhere in the honeycomb of tunnels carved into the southern cliffs, thousands more waited to join them. Henry sat alone near the ruins of a Shinto shrine, cleaning his M1 Garand for the third time that morning. The rifle did not need cleaning. His hands needed something to do. Around him, the men of the 6th Marine Division prepared for another cave clearance operation. Flamethrower teams checked their equipment. Demolition specialists counted charges. Nobody spoke much anymore. 3 months of combat had burned the conversation out of them. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitfield walked the perimeter, barking orders that sounded more like prayers. He had commanded the operation since April, watched his regiment shrink from fresh-faced replacements to hollow-eyed survivors. 2 weeks ago, his first platoon had entered a cave system near Shuri Castle. Japanese soldiers had sealed the entrance behind them and set the tunnels on fire. 32 Marines burned alive in the darkness. Whitfield still heard their screams when he closed his eyes. He would not make that mistake again. The orders were simple. Clear the caves. Use grenades, satchel charges, and flamethrowers. Anyone inside was the enemy. No exceptions. Henry understood the logic. The Japanese military had fortified Okinawa with over 60 miles of tunnels. Soldiers hid in the darkness, emerging to kill and then vanishing again. Surrender was not in their vocabulary. The Bushido Code demanded death before dishonor, and the Imperial Army enforced that code with bullets for anyone who tried to give up. Cave warfare had become a nightmare of close-quarters killing, where a single hidden soldier could take out an entire squad before anyone knew he was there, but something bothered Henry. Something he could not explain to the others that he heard crying, not the screams of soldiers or the moans of the wounded. Something different. Higher. Softer. The sound drifted from the cave mouths when the wind shifted, carried on the stench of human waste and rotting flesh. Children crying. Women begging. Old voices coughing in the darkness. Henry had not told anyone about the sounds. He knew what they would say. Combat fatigue. Shell shock. The island getting inside his head. Maybe they were right. Maybe the war had finally broken something in him that could not be fixed, but he kept listening anyway. The photograph in his breast pocket showed his sister Margaret, 19 years old and smiling in front of their family home in Ohio. She had been deaf since birth. When Henry was 12, he learned American Sign Language so he could talk to her. By 16, he was fluent. By 18, he had shipped out to the Pacific, leaving behind the only person who truly understood him. Margaret had taught him something important before he left. She said that when you cannot hear, you learn to see. When you cannot speak, you learn to show. The world was full of people screaming at each other across languages and borders, but nobody ever stopped to look. Henry looked now. At the cave entrances. At the flies. At the darkness waiting to swallow them all. The clearance operation began at 1,400 hours. The Marines moved in standard formation, covering each other as they approached the ridge. The first cave mouth gaped like a wound in the limestone, 20 feet wide and sloping down into blackness. Private First Class Tommy Reeves stood beside Henry, his flamethrower tank strapped to his back, the pilot light hissing in the afternoon heat. "Ready?" Tommy asked. Henry nodded. He was not ready. He would never be ready. Then he saw her. A small figure emerged from the cave entrance. Not a soldier. Not a threat. A child. Maybe 6 years old. She wore a torn kimono covered in dirt and dried blood. Her hair hung in matted clumps around a face so thin that her cheekbones looked ready to tear through the skin. She carried a white cloth in one hand, a makeshift surrender flag, and she walked directly toward the Marines with her eyes fixed on something beyond them. Something only she could see. The Marines raised their weapons. Standard procedure. Anyone emerging from a cave could be carrying explosives. Henry stepped forward. He lowered his rifle. "Wait," he said. The girl stopped 10 feet away. She looked at Henry. She raised her hands, and she began to sign. Her movements were crude, desperate, nothing like the fluid language Henry knew. But he understood enough. He understood the word for mother. The word for sick. The word for please. Behind the girl, from deep within the cave, he heard them again. The crying. The begging. The coughing. Not soldiers, families. Darkness has a weight that only those who have crawled through it can understand. Henry Maddox felt it pressing against his chest as he moved deeper into the cave, the limestone walls narrowing around him like the throat of some ancient beast. His flashlight cut a weak yellow circle through the black, illuminating nothing but rock and shadow and the desperate scratch marks where human fingernails had clawed at the stone that he had made his choice. Against orders. Against every survival instinct the Marine Corps had beaten into him over 3 years of war. The little girl had led him to the entrance and pointed inside, her hands still shaking as she signed the only words she knew. Mother. Sick. Please. Then she had collapsed from exhaustion, and the corpsman had carried her away to the field hospital. But her message had burned itself into Henry's mind. Someone was alive in there. Many someones. The smell hit him first. Human waste. Rotting food. The sweet copper stench of old blood. Then the sounds. Breathing. Whimpering. The rustle of bodies packed too close together in spaces never meant for living. Henry had trained for close-quarters combat in tunnels just like this one. He knew that Japanese soldiers had rigged many caves with explosives, that they hid inside chambers waiting to ambush anyone foolish enough to enter. He knew that walking in alone and unarmed was suicide, that he walked anyway. The tunnel opened into a chamber the size of a small church. His flashlight swept across the space, and Henry stopped breathing. They were everywhere. Hundreds of them. Crammed against the walls, huddled in clusters, lying on the bare stone floor. Women clutching infants to their chests. Old men with hollow eyes and skin stretched tight over bone. Children who stared at him with the blank expressions of those who had already accepted death. The chamber stank of fear and desperation, of weeks without sunlight or hope. The screaming started immediately. A woman near the front lunged toward him, shrieking in Japanese, her hands raised like claws. Others scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the far wall. Children wailed. Someone began chanting, a prayer, Henry realized, a Buddhist death prayer, and soon dozens of voices joined in, filling the cave with the sound of people preparing to die. Henry dropped to his knees. He placed his flashlight on the ground, pointing the beam away from the crowd. He raised his empty hands above his head and held perfectly still. The Japanese Imperial Army had told these people what Americans would do to them. The propaganda had been relentless. American soldiers would rape the women. They would torture the men. They would eat the children. Death was preferable to capture. Many Okinawan civilians had already chosen that path, jumping from cliffs, drowning themselves in the ocean, killing their own families rather than surrender. The mass suicides at the cliffs near Mabuni had claimed thousands of lives. These people expected the same fate. Henry had to show them something different. An old woman pushed through the crowd. She moved slowly, her back bent, her face a map of wrinkles and suffering. But her eyes were sharp, clear, unafraid. She positioned herself between Henry and the civilians, spreading her arms wide. "Korosu nara watashi wasaki and I," she said. Her voice did not waver. "Kill me first." Henry kept his hands raised. He began to sign that he did not know Japanese sign language. But language was more than words. It was gesture and expression, intent and emotion. He signed slowly, carefully, using the universal vocabulary of the body. "I am alone. I carry no weapon. I will not hurt you. Please. Trust me." The old woman watched his hands. She did not understand the specific signs. But she understood something else. She understood that this American soldier had come into the darkness alone, had knelt before them, had asked instead of demanded. A younger woman approached. Maybe 30 years old, with the bearing of someone accustomed to leadership. Her English was broken but functional. "You speak with hands?" Henry nodded. "My sister. She cannot hear. I learned for her." The woman stared at him. Her name was Keiko Nakamura. Before the war, she had taught elementary school in Naha. Her husband had died in an American bombing raid 3 months ago. She had guided over 1,000 civilians into these caves when the fighting reached their village, and she had kept them alive through weeks of starvation and terror. She had every reason to hate him. "Why you come?" Keiko asked. Henry lowered his hands. He reached slowly into his pocket and removed the photograph of his sister. "Because someone taught me to see," he said. Instead of just looking. Outside, the demolition teams were preparing their charges. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield had discovered Henry missing and ordered the cave clearance to proceed at dawn. In 8 hours, these tunnels would be sealed forever. Keiko took the photograph. She studied Margaret's smiling face for a long moment, then she turned to her people and began to speak. The explosion shook dust from the ceiling like snow falling in hell. Henry threw himself over a cluster of children as rocks rained down around them, his body acting before his mind could catch up. The cave trembled. Women screamed. Somewhere deeper in the tunnel system, a secondary collapse sent a rush of stale air blasting through the chamber, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of cordite and burning stone. The demolition had begun early. Keiko grabbed Henry's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh with desperate strength. "They are sealing us inside." Henry pulled himself upright, counting the seconds between explosions. The charges were hitting the outer tunnels first, collapsing the secondary entrances that honeycombed the ridge. Standard military procedure for cave clearance: eliminate escape routes before destroying the main chamber. Whoever had given the order did not know that 1,500 civilians huddled in the darkness below. Or maybe they knew and had decided it did not matter. "We have to move," Henry said. "Now. Everyone. Toward the main entrance." Keiko translated, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of someone who had kept these people alive for weeks through sheer force of will. The civilians began to stir, helping each other to their feet, gathering the children who could not walk on their own. But many hesitated. The old woman who had first confronted Henry stood firm, her arms crossed, her face set in grim resignation. "Outside is death," she said through Keiko. "The Americans will shoot us. At least here we die together, as Japanese." Henry understood her fear. He had seen what happened when civilians emerged from caves without warning. Nervous trigger fingers. Mistaken identities. Bodies crumpling in the dirt before anyone could shout a ceasefire. The Battle of Okinawa had killed over 100,000 Okinawan civilians already, caught between two armies that viewed them as obstacles at best and enemies at worst. Another explosion. Closer this time. The limestone groaned. "I will go first," Henry said. "I will tell them. I will make them stop. And if they do not stop..." Henry met the old woman's eyes. "Then I die with you." He did not wait for a response. He turned and ran toward the main entrance, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls as he navigated the narrowing tunnel. Behind him, he heard Keiko shouting orders, heard the shuffle of hundreds of feet beginning to move. They were following. They were trusting him that he could not fail them. The entrance appeared as a gray smudge against the absolute black, dawn light filtering through the cave mouth, muted by smoke and dust. Henry burst into the open air and immediately threw himself flat as a burst of rifle fire cracked overhead. Marines had taken positions along the ridge, their weapons trained on the cave entrance. A flamethrower team crouched 20 yards away, the operator adjusting his nozzle. "Hold fire!" Henry screamed. "Hold fire!" Civilians inside. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield's voice cut through the chaos. Who the hell is that? Identify yourself. Henry rose slowly, his hands above his head, his Marine uniform visible in the growing light. Corporal Henry Maddox, sir. 1st Battalion, 6th Marines. There are civilians in the cave. Women and children. Over 1,000 of them. Whitfield approached, his pistol drawn, his face a mask of exhausted fury. The past 82 days had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth, aging him 20 years in 3 months. He had buried too many men to count. He had watched friends burn alive in tunnels just like this one. You disobeyed a direct order, Corporal. You could be shot. Yes, sir. You entered an unsecured cave system alone and unarmed. That's suicide. Yes, sir. Give me one reason I shouldn't have you arrested right now. Henry reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around the small doll the little girl had pressed into his hands before she collapsed, a traditional Japanese ninja with a painted porcelain face and a silk kimono now stained with cave dirt and tears. She had wanted him to give it to his sister. She had thought she was going to die that he held out the doll. A child gave me this, sir. She wanted someone to remember her. Whitfield stared at the doll. His hand trembled. Behind Henry, the first civilians began to emerge from the cave. They walked slowly, blinking against the daylight, their arms raised in surrender. Women carrying infants. Old men supporting each other. Children holding hands in chains of 2s and 3s. They looked like ghosts rising from the underworld, skeletal, filthy, terrified, but alive. Keiko walked at their head. She met Whitfield's eyes without flinching. We do not want to die, she said in careful English. We only want to live. The Marines watched in silence as the procession continued. 100 civilians. 200. 500. They kept coming, an endless stream of humanity pouring from the darkness into the light. Whitfield holstered his pistol. Medics, he shouted. Get the medics up here. And someone find these people some water. Henry let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. The little girl with the doll had survived. The old woman who expected death had survived. 1,500 people who should have burned in the darkness were walking into the morning sun. The war was not over. The killing would continue. But here, on this ridge, something had changed, something worth remembering. The refugee camp spread across a flattened rice paddy 3 miles behind the front lines, a makeshift city of canvas tents and salvaged wood that had appeared overnight like something grown rather than built. Henry Maddox sat at its edge, watching the sunrise paint the destroyed landscape in shades of gold and amber, and tried to remember what peace felt like. The guns still thundered to the south. The war still ground forward. But here, in this fragile pocket of calm, 1,500 people who should have died were learning to live again. 3 days had passed since the rescue. Military doctors had worked around the clock, treating malnutrition and dehydration, setting broken bones, delivering 2 babies who entered the world crying in the arms of American nurses. The mortality rate was lower than anyone expected. These people had survived weeks in the caves on rainwater and insects, on roots and determination, on the simple human refusal to give up, but not everyone had made it. Henry carried their names in his pocket, written on a scrap of paper in Keiko's careful handwriting. 12 souls who had died before reaching the surface. 2 elderly men whose hearts had given out during the climb. A pregnant woman who had hemorrhaged in the darkness. 9 children, whose small bodies had simply stopped fighting. He did not know their faces. He would never know their stories. But he would carry their names until he died. The little girl found him as the sun cleared the horizon. She walked across the muddy ground with the careful steps of someone still learning to trust solid earth beneath her feet, and she sat beside him without speaking. Her name was Yuki. She was 6 years old. Her mother had survived, barely, and was recovering in the medical tent. Her father had died at Shuri Castle 2 months before the caves, Yuki did not know sign language. Her gestures in the cave had been desperate invention, a child's attempt to communicate across an impossible divide. But she had learned quickly in the days since the rescue, watching Henry's hands, mimicking his movements, building a bridge between worlds one word at a time. She signed now. Simple words. Thank you. Friend. Safe, Henry signed back. You are welcome. I am glad. Keiko approached from the camp, carrying 2 cups of weak tea. She had become the unofficial liaison between the refugees and their American rescuers, translating needs and fears, smoothing conflicts before they could ignite. The military had offered her formal status as an interpreter. She had refused. She would not wear their uniform or take their money. But she would help her people survive. The colonel wants to see you, she said, handing Henry a cup. He has made a decision about your case. Henry nodded. He had expected this. Disobeying direct orders in combat was a court-martial offense. The fact that his disobedience had saved 1,500 lives did not change the military calculus. Rules existed for reasons. Exceptions created chaos. Someone had to be held accountable. He found Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield standing outside the command tent, staring at a map that showed the final phase of the Okinawa campaign. The Japanese defensive line had collapsed. Organized resistance would end within the week. The battle that had consumed so many lives was finally grinding to its conclusion. Sir, Henry said, saluting. Whitfield returned the salute without looking up. At ease, Corporal. He folded the map slowly, deliberately, like a man buying time. I've written my report on the cave incident. Submitted it to division headquarters this morning. Yes, sir. I recommended you for the Bronze Star. Henry blinked. Sir. Valor in combat. Risk of life. Saving civilian non-combatants. Whitfield finally met his eyes. Division rejected it. They said the operation was unauthorized. They said recognizing your actions would encourage other Marines to disobey orders. Henry understood. The military could not reward insubordination, even when insubordination was right. The system demanded consistency. The system demanded obedience. The system could not acknowledge that sometimes the rules were wrong. I see, sir. But I want you to know something, Corporal. Whitfield reached into his pocket and withdrew the porcelain doll, the ninjio that Yuki had given Henry in the darkness. I'm keeping this in my desk. When I get home, I'm going to put it on a shelf where I can see it every day. And when my grandchildren ask me about the war, I'm going to tell them about the Marine who walked into a cave alone and saved 1,500 lives. He paused. The system won't remember you, Maddox. But I will. Henry took a breath. The weight on his chest, the weight he had carried since the caves, shifted slightly. It did not disappear. It would never disappear. But it became bearable. Thank you, sir. He walked back to the refugee camp as the morning light spread across Okinawa. The war would end in 2 months. The atomic bombs would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world would change in ways no one could predict. But the people in this camp would survive. They would return to their villages, rebuild their homes, raise their children in a country transformed by fire and blood. Yuki waited for him at the edge of the camp. She had found a piece of paper and a charcoal stick, and she had drawn a picture while he was gone. A cave. A figure walking into darkness. A hand reaching out toward the light. She gave it to Henry. She signed 2 words, remember us. Henry folded the drawing carefully. He placed it in his pocket beside the list of names, beside the photograph of his sister, beside all the things he carried that no one else could see. Always, he said, Keiko translated. Yuki smiled, the first real smile Henry had seen since the caves, and took his hand. Together, they walked into the morning.